It was early in the morning when King Richard was officially informed that the enemy army had abandoned their camp and had started moving towards Embion Hill. The information had completely caught the king by surprise, as he had in no way expected that the numerically inferior army would have decided to take offensive action. After issuing the necessary orders, Richard traveled to the front lines to personally carry out an inspection of what could be observed of the enemy army. There was an excellent view from the hill, and to the south Henry's army could clearly be seen marching, armor glittering in the morning sun. A column of about 4,500 soldiers could be seen moving along the river to the east. Judging by the banners waving in the wind above the detachment, it was possible to ascertain that the backbone of the army was made up of mercenaries from France and Scotland, and that there were also small detachments of Englishmen and archers from Wales. As for King Henry himself, due to the fact that he had no combat experience, nor did he crave to take part in military affairs, he had handed over the command of the forces to the Earl of Oxford, who was a talented and experienced military commander. Further to the east, detachments led by Lord Stanley and Sir William Stanley, which appeared to number about 5,500, were already lined up. At the moment, they appeared to be taking a wait-and-see approach and were apparently currently maintaining their neutrality. It was obvious to everyone involved that the side which could obtain such a powerful ally would automatically become the winner of a battle. In the competition for the favor of the Stanleys, King Richard had an important advantage, that being that Stanley's son was currently under his own reliable protection in his encampment. Returning from a reconnaissance mission, the king saw that chaos was reigning throughout the camp. The battalion of the Earl of Oxford had begun an offensive before dawn and had caught the soldiers by surprise, and they were now feverishly putting on their armor and checking their weapons. The shouted orders and curses of the commanders could be heard from all sides as they tried to rise morale and bring the troops to battle readiness. The king was forced to do without the traditional prayer service before the battle, as none of his officers or soldiers could find a priest amid the chaos. As he started moving his forces towards the enemy, the Earl of Oxford directed his battalion to head right into the center of the enemy army. But then he ordered them to turn to the left and took up a position on Richard's right flank. It is not known exactly why the Count had decided to lead his army along such a trajectory, but according to one version, he had tried to provoke the enemy cavalry to attack his forces through a swamp. The right flank was also occupied by a detachment under the command of John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and consisted mainly of archers, numbering approximately 1,200, but also consisted of several hundred artillerymen and spearmen. In the center was the King's Battalion, which included 3,000 infantrymen and 800 horsemen. Providing cover on the left flank was a detachment of the Earl of Northumberland, consisting of 3,500 soldiers. Then, at the beginning of the battle, the king reinforced the right flank with infantry from his battalion. When the army approached each other, the archers engaged in a shootout with both sides using the famous English longbow, which in fact by that time had begun to be obsolete due to the qualitative advancements in body armor and the increase in its use on the battlefield. The arrows failed to cause serious damage to the opposing side, and thus Richard gave the order to attack. The soldiers of the Duke of Norfolk's battalion, cheering themselves on with shouts and battle cries, moved down the slope and upon approaching the enemy. The detachment cut into their ranks with a deafening clang as fierce hand-to-hand combat ensued. The king had expected that the mercenaries, being outnumbered, would not offer serious resistance and would quickly retreat. But the French and Scots steadfastly withstood the first onslaught and began to actually push back against their enemy. According to eyewitnesses, King Richard's soldiers were not eager to join the battle, and after having met serious resistance, some of the fighters deserted the battlefield. Concerned over such a development, King Richard ordered the Duke of Northumberland to attack from the flank, but he refused to comply with the order, and his battalion did not move. It is not known exactly why this occurred. However, according to one version, the Duke had a personal dislike for the king, and according to another, the lack of drilled training among his troops prevented him from making such a maneuver, using the deployed forces without destroying the order of battle. A critical moment had come in the battle. Even yesterday's victory had seemed to be inevitable, but slowly it was gradually slipping out of Richard's hands, and he urgently needed to find a solution that would turn the tide of the battle in his favor. Surveying the valley, the king noticed a small detachment, over which the banners of Henry were flying. The horsemen of the detachment were moving towards Stanley's army, in all probability intending to begin negotiations and lure the latter to their side. A decision instantly appeared and matured in the head of the monarch, and he immediately gathered his cavalry and rushed to attack. Having quickly overtaken the enemy, the detachment cut into the ranks of the enemy, with Richard himself leading the attack. He was in the first row and began fiercely striking the enemy, trying to break through the opponent's lines. The king managed to defeat the flag bearer and stunned several knights, but he failed to get to Henry as his bodyguards closed ranks and stood like an insurmountable wall protecting their ward. For a short while, the two squads fought fiercely, and it was in fact unknown how the fight would have ended if Stanley had not decided to intervene in the battle. His soldiers attacked King Richard's horsemen, who were stunned by the unexpected blow from the flank, and then fell back and fled. The king himself was thrown into the bog, and his horse got stuck in the quagmire. Richard refused an offer to take one of his knight's horses, exclaiming, "I will win this battle or die like a king." Then the detachment was surrounded by enemies, but they continued to fight with all their might. The standard bearer, whose legs had been severed, held onto the banner to the very end and was finally finished off with a piercing blow by a spear. Richard cursed the traitors in what seemed an impotent rage, and unwilling to give up, he furiously hacked away with his sword, fighting off the increasingly pressing numbers of the enemy, until finally the blow of a halberd sent the monarch flying into the ground. The news of the death of the king quickly spread throughout the army, and the soldiers, realizing that they no longer had anyone to fight for, threw down their weapons and fled or surrendered. The Battle of Bosworth had a decisive influence on the course of the War of the Roses,